Hi, everybody. Well, isn't this nice? We're all here. Give your lovely badass selves a huge round of applause to begin with. Yeah. Yes. Because, my friends, we've made it. We have reached the future. It is 2025, and we are surrounded by a glorious utopia. Our industry is booming. We have gender and racial equality at last. We can all get paid fairly for our time, which is lovely because it means we can afford those little luxuries. Our key politicians and big energy magnates, they use their vast wealth to protect and restore the environment. Agriculture is sustainable and works with nature. Our oceans are healthy. We have stable weather systems. And we are in a time of international peace and tranquility. On the plus side as well, our children, they have a healthy relationship with the tech that's been developed to keep them safe and to promote, healthy cognitive enhancement, as do we. Which is great because our tech bros have created tools for healthy, emotionally manageable social connection. And they've done this with our best interests at heart. And they're using their amassed wealth, their geopolitical influence, however long it lasts, whether that's years, months, or 128 days. They've done that to responsibly distribute high quality factual information and to focus on the projects that benefit us all, not to boost their own egos. And definitely, they are focusing on the most pressing projects for our race. And of course, how could I forget? AI is here properly this time, and it is a trustworthy and reliable force for good. We are winning. Yeah. Welcome to the Permacrisis. So we have a bit of a problem. Yeah. My name's Ceri. I am an OD specialist and interactions specialist. I'm also a trainee neuroscientist. That's been going on for a while now because I really like not having meningitis. I work with senior technical leaders globally, all over the place. And I specifically work on the gap between intent and impact. And I want to spend some time today exploring a bit of that gap because I feel like now's as good a time as any. And so in the face of this problem, I'm going to be, as you would expect, supported by everyone's best friend, our tool du jour. And because I, for one, would like to welcome our new overlords, of course, I'm going to use the masters of human digits themselves. Oh, brace yourselves, my friends. It gets so much worse. I'm going to spend today answering 3 questions. I want to look at the problems. What are the problems that the permacrisis that we are living through? What are the problems that creates for leaders? How do our minds respond to the experience of continuous crisis? And how can we better prepare ourselves? And that's got nothing to do with loo roll, I'm afraid. And what can we do to address the challenges that we're facing? I'm a nerd, so there are some resources and references here. I'll refer to studies occasionally as we're going through this. So if anybody likes reading the actual paper, then you can go and find those here. If my lovely admin hasn't gotten as far as uploading them yet, they'll be there tomorrow. Okay. So my AI assistant reliably informs me that Benjamin Franklin was the one who said that nothing is certain in life except for death and taxes. But it turns out that those are not the only guarantees. If we are lucky enough to live long enough, all of us are likely to face crisis in some kind, in some way or another. And that will be different for everybody, what that looks like. But when we see others in crisis, it's very easy for us to think, oh, how terrible, you poor thing. So glad that's not me. But it's not just other people. We live in a random universe, and no one is immune. I'll give you a minute to really appreciate that one. It's the second body for me. It turns out that crisis is an occupational hazard of being alive. And what's important then in this continual, everlasting, ongoing crisis is more how we respond. What do we do in the face of this non-stop adversity? And we've got a problem here because we are kind of surrounded by what's referred to as the scare to care technique. You might have seen this in news or social media. You might have seen it used by your politicians or maybe by some charity campaigns. And it changes our ability to respond well. And often it leaves us feeling a bit poo. Just one person. Yeah. It's fine. But for some, the increasing institutification of everything leads to a sense of disassociation, maybe of motivational paralysis. It can lead, in some cases, to burnout, and for some people, to much worse. It can lead to a sense of hopelessness, the recognition of how small we are, how powerless, how alone, and how big the problem is, the fact that maybe no one cares. And the negative feeling that we get from the realization that I can't solve the whole often outweighs the positive feeling that we get from solving little bits of it. And there's that suspicion, that fear that no one is coming to save the day. No one's coming to help. Not even this guy. Okay, so what happens when we pay people to do work, legwork, if you will? Well, there's the weight of expectation. Sorry. Henry Cavill. I believe he paid personally for this one. There is the weight of expectation. There's the everlasting risk of role and market uncertainty. There's economic instability, of course. There's perceived unfairness in the workplace. And on some days, even the emails and notifications that we receive can be completely overwhelming. And so this sends us into what I like to refer to as wet lettuce mode. And this is where we end up feeling really a bit emotionally burned out. So that scare to care, that onslaught, it's too much. And so we're left with nothing. Let's look at what's happening there. To do that, I'm going to look at a non-AI generated image, and you can tell because it's only got 5 fingers. Let's look at your brain with a handy model that I may have shown some of you before. So imagine that this is your brain. You can make this model yourself. You just take your hand, you put your thumb across your palm, and you close your fingers down over the top. And that is a handy take with you anywhere you go model of your brain. The 2 fingers in the middle here, that's representing your prefrontal cortex. Down here's your brain stem. That's the bit that looks after your heart rate, your breathing, your autonomic bodily functions. But this bit here, these fingers here, this is your prefrontal cortex, and it's connected with your decision-making, your problem-solving, your creativity, your ability to find solutions to things. This is you in a calm emotional state. But this is you in what Dr. Dan Siegel, the person who created this model, refers to as a flipped lid state. And this is where your amygdala triggers an emotional response. So that can look like fear or anger or aggression or anxiety. And what's important to note is that this bypasses your cortex. So that means this bit here with your rational problem solving, solution, creativity bit, that's no longer involved in what's going on. And there's additional struggle for us, right? we like to think that when we think about our workplaces, we like to think that it's some sort of family. Indeed, some workplaces describe themselves as a family, except that it's not, of course. It's a social structure, and because we're social beings, we're herd animals, we look to social structures to provide the kind of support that a social structure should. And so there's a level of expectation that comes with entering a workplace, the expectation that I will get a strong adult support system, that I will get close bonds with people, and the expectation that you won't fire grandma. But that's not what happens. And so what we actually have is this constant sense of unease, the knowledge that we can be let go from this social support structure really at any moment in time without very much warning. There's the threat of rejection, of ejection from this social group that we have decided to join. We are being kicked out of the herd, or there's the threat that we might be. So let me tell you about allostasis. This is where your brain anticipates and regulates and adjusts the amount of energy that you feel that you've got based on how threatening your brain has interpreted your current environment to be. So if you are in what could be considered a more threatening environment, then your brain will conserve more energy. If you are in an organization where there is the underlying threat of being rejected and kicked out, your brain is more likely to conserve more energy. So what that might look like is people saying, oh, you're unmotivated, or you're disengaged, or you won't take responsibility, or you don't take the initiative. Maybe you're feeling apathetic. Maybe you don't even have the energy to care. There's no point in complaining. Or maybe you're someone who actually just feels quite resistant to change, or can't accept or listen to or hear feedback or suggestions or criticism. So this environment feels unsafe, and so our brain conserves energy. And this isn't a conscious response. It happens in response to the subconscious message that's being received of, you're not safe, this isn't safe. And the more stress we're feeling, the worse that interpretation gets. We more heavily interpret the message, you're not safe here, and we won't support you. So there's some brain imaging that actually shows the effect of stress on your prefrontal cortex. That's the bit here with your creativity, problem solving. And what this is showing is that we actually have less connectivity, less function, so less ability to come up with solutions, less ability to be rational or solve problems. We actually have less attention, and we have lower emotional regulation. So that can lead to conflict. Maybe you become more argumentative, maybe you become more picky. It can look like drama, politics, pointing fingers at people instead of taking responsibility, or resistance to things. And this happens because stress alters our perception of our experience. And what's interesting is that whatever our experience is, we have the same physiological response, whether that's a positive or a negative emotion. So you might have experienced this yourself if you think back to the last, so that looks like a fast heart rate, a tight chest, maybe sweating. So you probably felt this yourself before. Think back for a moment to the last time you felt really excited about something. Yeah? Now, where did you feel that in your body? Where is that for you? For me, it's right here in my chest. That's where excitement is for me. What about the last time you felt anxiety? Think back to that. Where did you feel that? For me, it's right here in my chest. So the difference really is the story that I tell myself, and then the predictions that I make about the outcome that I expect to receive. And our environment and our experience are part of what changes the story. It's the same swell of feeling. It's just our perspective that changes how we interpret it. So the problem is that when we have less information, we fill the gaps in our information with the worst case scenario. And so it means that, for example, when we're in an organization where leaders maybe are being less transparent, we will assume that they have the worst intent. We will assume terrible things about their motives. We'll assume the worst about the market that we're operating within. We'll assume that they're making decisions for self-centered and selfish reasons. And this goes on to erode the amount of trust that we have in our leadership and in anybody else where we don't feel that we're getting that information from them. And it's contagious. So the stress that we feel as a result of this lack of information, this sense of unease, it actually causes a physical response. So it triggers the release of a neurochemical called norepinephrine. That comes out in your sweat. And when you sweat, norepinephrine and cortisol, I should say, and when you sweat these neurochemicals, it interacts differently with the bacteria on your skin. And so you actually smell different to the people around you compared to when you're sweating because of exercise or because it's so bloody hot. But the thing is that we pick up on these differences without being consciously aware of it. And you've probably experienced this if you've ever walked into a room and there's been a weird atmosphere, but maybe nobody's saying anything, you can tell right away. And that's because you can smell the stress in the air from people's sweat. So what that means is that you can have a leader who says that everything's okay, but on a level you can smell that everything is not okay. You can literally smell their bullshit. Incidentally, the neuroscientist who does this research is called Sarah Sniffen, which is just lovely. Okay, so this leads to a more negative perception of tone, of people's facial expressions. We interpret the language they use, the words, as more aggressive or more negatively, even if they think that they're actually being quite neutral. And our brains synchronize. So we tend to fall into a position where if we like each other on some level, we tend to agree. So if there are people in your team or in your workplace that you have affinity with and they're falling into this stressed, unease position, your brain will actually synchronize with theirs and you will pick up their unease and you will tend to agree with them. And then you will spread that unease yourself to other people that you are aligned with. And so it becomes a kind of a rather nasty little ripple effect. And that happens whether it's negative or positive influence. So with a more negative mood, we tend to see even neutral things as bad. We might see our peers as lazy or as selfish. If we don't know what they're doing, then we might class them as bad people. If they make mistakes, it's because they're bad people, not because of circumstances and things that happen to them. If I make mistakes, it's because of the things that happen to me. If you make mistakes, it's because you're an idiot. And we assume that people have negative motivations. We also suffer from something called under-sociability. And this is where we have a more negative estimation of the experience of socializing than the reported reality. And it's reinforced by messages that we receive in our childhood, like don't talk to strangers, don't take sweets from old ladies in bus stops. And there's an area of your brain called the reticular activating system, and it tends to pick up on patterns and similarities. And if you give it something to hook onto, it will hook onto every single thing like that. If you've ever bought a new car and then you suddenly see everybody else driving the same car as you, that's your reticular activating system in action. And your brain does this because it's much safer to assume that the large animal with spots running towards you is a cheetah that's going to attack you than to assume that it's just a cloud of butterflies floating merrily your way. Better safe than sorry. So it means then that we are primed and we notice any evidence that says that socializing and meeting other people is actually a negative experience. We assume it's going to be more negative, and then we look out for things that back that up, not consciously, but subconsciously we pick those things up. So that makes us then less social. It means that we then have less trust in the people around us. And I think if nothing else, we can see this in, sadly, the news and the media that surrounds us on a daily basis. It leads to more isolation, and it leads to increased skepticism. So we're less likely to believe people, even if they say they're trying to do good, because why should we believe them? Okay, I did. It's true. So the Stoics. What is Stoicism? Stoicism is not the thing that I think a lot of the tech bros have got a hold of. Stoicism is the rather delightful perspective of the world that what is, and we can waste time and energy arguing with reality. Or if we prefer, we can maybe get on and do something about it. We can take whatever steps are available to us. It's not suck it up, sunshine. More, well, this is what is. So given that this is what is, what can we do? I rather like that attitude. It's gotten me through some really tough times. Like I mentioned before, 2 lots of meningitis. You can't change that. I could argue with it. I could be really angry. But it is what it is. And then you have to work out where you're going to go from there. So let me tell you a story of something rather extraordinary. On April the 17th, 2018, Southwest Airlines Flight 1380 was flying from New York to Dallas. They were about 20 minutes into their flight. They were at an altitude of about 32,500 feet when there was an explosion. The plane shook and rolled and began to plummet. The turbine fan in the left engine had exploded. It had ripped a hole in the side of the plane, and there was shrapnel and a broken window, and a passenger was lost. The plane dropped 18,000 feet in 5 minutes, and Captain Tammy Jo Schultz described it as something like driving on black ice. Every time she tried to steer the plane left, it would roll completely. So they were traveling at 500 miles per hour. There was no oxygen in the cabin, and there was debris flying around everywhere. And Tammy, doing her best to control this rapid descent, somehow managed to have the presence of mind to consider and predict the fear and the terror that was being experienced by the people in the back of the plane. And so she decided to tell them what was going on. Over the tannoy, she announced, "We're not crashing. This is a controlled descent," instantly allaying the fear of everybody in the back of the plane who surely thought that this was it. And she also predicted that people wanted to get right off that plane the moment it landed. So when she later successfully landed that plane with her co-pilot, she had the presence of mind to turn the flaps on the wings down so that people could slide off more quickly and safely and easily. And for the people that were remaining on the plane who hadn't got off yet, she came out of the cockpit, out of her sealed, safe cockpit, and walked down the aisle, meeting the passengers, telling them how brave they'd been, what an extraordinary experience that they'd had, how wonderful it was to be alive, and encouraging them. And she had a medical check straight after this crash. They found absolutely no elevated pulse. She was completely calm. And she passed that calm on to the people in the back of the cabin, despite their ordeal. Well, I've messed this up. I've accidentally left a transition, and this is just going to go horribly for me. God knows what it's going to do, but we'll see. There might be some pictures, there might not. Anyway, so Tammy was in the Navy, and she was one of the first women to be able to fly the FA-18 Hornet. She was renowned for remaining steadfast and calm, for always planning one step ahead. She also had a reputation for mentoring, for being caring. She always was taking into account what people were likely to need. Oh, there she is. Yeah, there we go. This is why I don't know how transitions. Bloody awful. Okay, now this is the Costa Concordia in Italy from 2012. It was steered too close to a reef, its hull was ruptured, and unfortunately, 32 passengers and crew lost their lives. The person responsible for the safety and evacuation of the people on board was Captain Francesco Schettino, this guy. But he actually ran away. He got in one of the lifeboats. He claimed that he fell in, but he managed to fall in having changed out of his uniform and into plain clothes, despite the fact that his ship was sinking. And then when that was called out, he claimed that he was there to oversee the evacuation. There's a very famous recording of the Coast Guard screaming and swearing at him to return to the ship. He did not. Eventually, he was jailed for 16 years, but even during the trial, he continued to refuse to take any responsibility. He tried to pin the blame on other people, on the helmsman, or on faults with the vessel. So what we're seeing here is the difference between two kinds of leaders. And when we're in crisis, there are a few things we need. Tammy Jo Schultz was what is known as a terry cloth leader. So that is, she was gentle, she was comforting, secure and firm, and she managed to somehow catch all the shit. However, Scatino, on the other hand, was what is known as a wire mesh leader. That is abrasive, cold, still caught the shit, but unfortunately most of it was able to seep through to everything underneath. Okay, this is going to be a leap. You're going to get to enjoy this guy for a while. So in times of stress, we are drawn to charismatic leaders. So for the next few minutes, let's ask Sexy Birdman to give us some traits to aim for when we find ourselves in these positions. So the key traits of successful leaders, the people who are able to weather the storm, key traits are those who are optimistic, who are courageous, who are generous, over the ones that are pessimistic, cowardly, or selfish. What a shocker. Who'd have thought? But sometimes we are hungry. Sometimes we are under pressure or tired. Maybe we're experiencing something new, or we've been upset by someone. For example, Rachel Reeves crying in the Commons yesterday, not because she'd been fired, but because she'd had some upsetting personal news. It's really easy to misinterpret these things. And sometimes that means that we're not able to cope as well with the pressure in the moment. And shame is such a destructive emotion. And it's something that often stops us trying. So what we can do instead is move away from blaming ourselves or anyone. Blame is not a helpful response, because no one is perfect. But what we can do instead is we can begin by holding ourselves accountable. This is what is, and this was my part in what is. This is from the Stoics. The Stoics ask us to focus on what is, much more than focusing on what we think should be. Sure, we can take steps towards that, but if we waste time arguing about what should be instead of focusing on what is and what we can do next, we're going to waste quite a lot of time, energy, effort, and heartache. We don't need to argue over why we're not there yet. We need to work out what the steps are to get there. So to begin holding yourself accountable, we can use a very common, very familiar tool, I hope to most of us. We can retrospect. We can actually look at what we've done, look at what's happened, and ask ourselves, how can this go better next time? What can I do differently? What can I change? Whatever the situation is that we've just experienced, whether that's a difficult conversation or a sprint planning session or a talk that you've just delivered or a dinner that you've just made or, I don't know, a car parking space. Anyway, how can you do better next time? Another thing that we can do is, if we find ourselves falling into those traps of the less successful leaders, if we find ourselves when we're under stress and when we're tired, we can reverse our steps. So, for example, if we find ourselves in a position of power, instead of holding on to that power for ourselves, a terry cloth leader approach would be to be aware of your impact in that situation. So when we say things like, we need to talk, I need to talk to you, and that's all we send in the email, maybe we want to be considerate of what that's going to look like, how that's going to be received on the other end. I know of people who have spent whole weekends crying after receiving that email. We can fill the gaps for people. I need to talk to you about this, so that. And that means that we stop people from suspecting the worst. Instead of stealing credit from people, we can find ways to share credit. celebrate their wins. It's okay if we took part in that as well. We can celebrate our part in it, but celebrating our wins as a shared success, giving kudos where it's necessary. Instead of micromanaging, we can find ways to empower people. We can share responsibility. We can invite their perspective. We can share decision-making where it's possible and reasonable to do so. We can also adopt a visionary state of mind. So by reflecting on our values, by asking ourselves the question, what's important to you? It actually changes the language that we choose. So this is something that I've done with senior leaders before they go into difficult conversations, asking them what's important to you? What is the outcome that you want to achieve? By going in and having this conversation, and how do you need to be in order to get that outcome? How do you need to act? What's important to you? So getting people to reflect on their values, on how they want to show up and why, that helps them change their language and tone, and most likely their sweat. We can also use something called perspective taking and perspective getting. Now, perspective taking, you've probably all heard of. That's where you try and consider things from the other person's point of view. So what would this look like if I was the person receiving that email? Perspective getting is we go and we check our assumptions by going and asking the person specifically, how did that land with you? I think that this came across in this way. How close am I to the truth? We can then use that information to change how we do things next time. If we're a mile apart, we can use that to do better. If we're quite close, then we can use that to then repeat our success. I'm giving another talk tomorrow that actually looks at different ways that we can do perspective getting and perspective taking. So I'll be able to talk about the worry wall. And these approaches are really important because they start to build trust or rebuild trust. When we actually take the time to ask the other person how it is that we're landing with them, we're showing them that we're invested in the outcome for them. We're showing them that we care. It is a really strong leadership trait. And you don't have to be in a leadership position to do these things. Any of us can do this in any of our relationships to a really positive, beneficial effect. We can also offer people options instead of a binary, this or that, black or white approach. So we can offer them these instead. And that gives people a sense of autonomy. It also sends a message, an unspoken message of when there are multiple options, there's no right or wrong. When it's black or white, one answer is right and one answer is wrong. When there's multiple, many of these things could be the next best thing. Many of them could be rubbish. Maybe they're all equally good, or maybe they're all equally rubbish, but there's no right answer. So let's explore and see what we get. So giving people options. And we can also elevate people's status where we can. So there are three different kinds of status: status of success, status of power, and status of virtue. So if we can find ways to elevate people's sense of success, or find ways to elevate their sense of virtue or their sense of power, that can be a really good pro-social approach to take. And that then empowers other people who maybe weren't feeling that bold about what they do and how they do it. That can help to empower them to feel bolder about taking decisive action, about taking risks, about exploring, about trying something new. It also has the added bonus of increasing the amount of respect and trust between you. Okay, so there is some hope for us cynics. What we have here is a number of tiny achievable steps, small ways that we can change what we do and how we do it. Small experiments, one tiny amount of change at a time. And I've used this quite successfully in a number of different leadership teams. So moving senior engineering teams or technical leadership teams, CTO and the level above and below, from a position of defensiveness, of being really protectionist about the information that they had, to being much more transparent, much more open, culminating in a lovely moment at an internal conference where one extremely senior leader was finally able to answer a question from the audience with, honestly, I don't know. It doesn't sound like much, but really that was a huge step for him. These weren't words that were ever spoken in that environment. And by setting the example and modeling these behaviors, we start to make it okay for the people around us and the people maybe who report into us to start doing the same thing as well. Okay. So with the team that I was referring to there, we actually began with some very simple questions. So we started with a conversation around, what do you really want here? And if that's what you really genuinely want, not just what you think you should say that you want, but if that's genuinely what you want, what are you willing to do, or what are you willing to let go of to get it? And it, again, doesn't sound like a big question. It doesn't sound like a big conversation. But for the relationship in that particular organization, that question was pivotal. And what we're asking here, in essence, we're considering the needs of our people. And we are asking them, what do you need to meet my need? And when we start asking that question, we're not demanding of them to meet my need. We are asking them how we can help, how we can empower them. We're putting them in the driving seat. Terry cloth leadership. So we want to begin then treating our culture like a product. The environment that we create for people has to make them want to buy into it if they're going to perform well, especially in turbulent times, especially in the environment that we find ourselves in right now. We need to create an environment that is inspiring, that is safe, and that is what then makes it motivating. It also takes people out of that flip-lid or anxious state. Obviously, you can't control what's going on for them outside of work, but certainly at least you can provide something resembling a safe environment in work. And it means that we can take people from that anxious, uneasy state into a position where maybe they feel keen, maybe they feel engaged, possibly, who knows, let's really go out on a limb, maybe they feel occasionally joyous. In crisis, in times of crisis, really this is all we have. We have tiny moments, but those tiny moments, those tiny bubbles of safety and calm and modeling supportive pro-social behaviors repeated over time, they're what reshape our perspective of our experience and change how we feel about it. It's nothing to do with me, but you're welcome. Come in. Okay, so I want to finish with one last story. And this is probably another one that's familiar to you, but in 2018, the wild boars and their assistant coach decided to go and explore Tham Luang Cave. Probably mispronouncing that horribly. And they went there quite often, and they explored up to 8 kilometers inside this cave system. They went there quite frequently for initiation rites. So they would go into the caves and they would write the names of new team members on the cave wall. However, the days before their visit, there had been heavy rain and there was a flash flood. The water forced them to retreat further and further inside the cave. They actually ended up retreating more than 4 kilometers inside this cave system. And they eventually found themselves stuck on a ledge with the water around them continuing to rise. They were there for almost 2 weeks. And in those 2 weeks, international rescue teams of divers, of Navy SEALs, of engineers did everything that they could to get them out. What's extraordinary is that all 13 survived. And when they were met by the first diving team that found them, the question that they asked was, can we go out now? So the 13 of them survived with torches, no food, drinking water that was dripping from the roof and the walls of the cage through the porous limestone rock. They had limited air, but they survived. And they were led by a 25-year-old, their assistant coach, not even the head coach, their assistant coach, Ekapol Ek Chantawong. Ek was actually orphaned when he was 4 years old. He went to live in a Buddhist monastery. And And he helped the boys get through this ordeal by insisting every day on a 6 a.m. wake up, followed by focused activity with purpose, where they would try and dig their way out of the mountain. He was telling them stories of this beautiful orange grove that was just the other side of the rock. So all they had to do each day was spend some time digging, and they would get through, and they would talk about how delicious these fabulous oranges would taste when they got to the other side. He also spent time with them conserving what air there was in meditation. He taught them how to meditate. Of course, he'd learned this in his time at the monastery, so helping to stay calm, conserve air, and not trigger their amygdala. And he offered them regular affirmation. You can do this. You can cope with this. When he was at the monastery, he was taught to survive on 1 meal a day. So he told them stories of having to survive on virtually no food. I can do it. I was 4. You're bigger than I was. You can do this. You've got this. He also was really careful about the language that he used. He didn't talk about drowning or rocks crashing. He talked he used hopeful language. He was proactive and optimistic all the way through. So I want to close then with some lessons from X leadership. Firstly, his acceptance of what is. Because there's no point spending time on the rest. We can let go of everything else and focus on what is and what's next. Openness about the difficulty of the situation, the reality of where we find ourselves, not trying to cover it over, not trying to blame anyone or pretend it doesn't exist, but being realistic about where we are without being pessimistic about where we are. Also offering stability. So some sort of routine, regular tasks, focus, intent, shared purpose. That direction that he gave them, dig out, that's what we're doing. And that meditation to conserve energy until help comes, directive, intentional activities. And finally, responsibility. When they were finally rescued, the first thing that he did was he went and apologized to all of the parents of the boys stuck in the cave. He didn't try and shove the blame onto anyone else. He took full responsibility for taking them in and for looking after them and getting them into that situation. And he said sorry for it. Now, the impact on those boys was that they were malnourished, of course, but when they were rescued, they were in astoundingly good spirits, despite their horrific ordeal. And that's the message that really I would like you to take away from this. Yes, there is quite a lot going on in the world around us, but that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can do. We can waste time talking about the way that we think things should be, but we'll get much more out of our experience and have a better time of it if we begin with what is and what we can do next. And with that, I invite you to now go slay. Thank you.